topic, that is functions. So first we'll see what is this, what is the concept of these functions in programming, and then we'll see how to use the functions in right in the program. Okay, so first of all, first what is the use of these functions is, see, if you have a very a complex task is there, and you are trying to code write a program for that complex task, so where one individual is trying to write the whole task, or one individual is trying to write a program for the complete task, that means a complete program. So instead of writing it with one individual, you can make the task into sub parts, and those sub parts can be coded by individually by each individual, and then simply you can combine that whole sub parts to make it into one unit. So those sub parts are called as, or sub programs are called as, functions in C program. Okay, suppose if you are having a task like this, and simply, so you are writing your task is this one. So what I'm doing is I'm simply dividing that into three parts. I'll say part A, part B, and part C. Okay, I'm dividing my complete task into three parts. And suppose the part A is written by one person, part B is written by the other person, and part C is written by the other person. That means three individuals are writing the code for this. So one individual is writing for part A, the second one is writing for part B, and third one is writing for part C. And after completing their parts, you can simply combine that to form it into a single unit, and those sub parts, the sub parts are called as sub programs. So one complete program, you are dividing it into sub programs, and after writing the code for those sub programs, you are combining it. Those sub programs are called as functions in C language. Those sub programs are called as functions in C language. Here basically we have two types of functions. One is a predefined function and the other one is user defined function. So predefined functions are, we have already using these predefined functions in our programs by saying printf. So printf is one predefined function which we are using very regularly in the programs, right? In the same way, scanf is also one predefined function. So what is a predefined and what is user defined means? So predefined functions are the one, so you, by the name you can identify, they are already defined. They are already defined. And then what are we doing? We are simply using those predefined functions in our programs. So those functions, those predefined functions like printf, you say, you are writing something in the double quotations, and that statement is getting displayed on your output screen. Whatever I write in between these double quotations, so those statements are getting displayed on my output screen. So how it is displaying? The code was already written by someone, and I am simply using that printf function for displaying my statement. Okay. In the same way, scanf. Scanf is also one predefined function. which is used for reading the values. How it is reading the values, we don't know. It was already coded by someone. If I write ampersand, percentile D and ampersand A, it will read a value and that value will stored into the variable A. That is what we know. But what internally it is happening, that we don't know. That was already defined by someone and we are just using those functions for reading the values. The same way we have many other functions like to calculate power. There is one predefined function called POW of x comma y. So you know this function POW? Hello? 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 Someone there? Yes. Okay. So we have a function called POW of x comma y, which means it simply calculates the value of x power y. If I give 5 comma 2, it calculates the value of 5 square. So how it is calculating the value of 5 square is we don't bother about it because it is already defined like some other function like SQRT. SQRT is one function which calculates the square root of the value which you give here. If I give SQRT of 25, it gives me 5. That means the square root of 25. So like that way, we have some predefined functions are there, which we are simply using those functions whenever we require them. Okay. And the other type of functions is user defined functions. User defined functions. So in this user defined functions, as a user, it is my responsibility to define my own function. If I want to calculate the value of say a plus b star c modular d. If I want to calculate this, there is no predefined function exists for calculating this kind of expression. There is no predefined function exists for calculating this kind of expression. In that case, what I need to do is I have to define my own user defined function. I have to define my own user defined function which calculates this. So when you are writing your user defined function, you can give the name of your choice. Here POW is a fixed name which is already defined and that person has given that name. Whoever has defined, so they have given the name of that function as POW. In some other function, that is SQRT, instead of a square root, it was given as SQRT. So the names of the functions are fixed in the case of the predefined functions. But whereas in the case of the user defined functions, the names are user's choice. The names are user's choice. User can give his own name. I can write the statements whatever I want to calculate, whether I want to calculate a plus b star c modular d, or if I want to calculate a by b star c, or if I want to calculate factorial of any number, if I want to say calculate a factorial of 5, or if I want to calculate the value of x factorial, I can define my own function which can calculate or which can perform this kind of operations. Those functions are called as user defined functions. Those functions are called as user defined functions. So where the user is going to define his own function. When the user is defining his own function, he can give his own name. He can perform the operations on his own. Okay. So this is about user defined functions and predefined functions. See, what you need to write when a user want to define his own function. When a user is defining his own function, he must include these three elements. When a user defined function is, you are writing a user defined function in the program, it includes these three elements. One is function definition, function call, and third one is function declaration. Function definition, function call, and function declaration. So first we'll see what is the function definition means. See, when a user is writing any user defined function, the very first part user should write is function definition. So what actually this function definition includes is it looks like this. This is what, so all the statements, whatever I want to write, I'll write the statements in between these 2 points. Here I'll write all the statements. Okay. So what here actually will have in the user defined function is, the first one is the function header. This is the two parts, function header and function body. So the pink color, I have rounded something. So this is the function header, and this one is called as a function body. So these are the two parts that are included in the function definition. So I'm just giving an example how a function definition looks. It includes majorly two parts. First one is the function header. The second one is the function body. Function header is this one. Okay, this part is called as the function header. Void factorial int x. So first three parts which are there here. So these are the parts of the function header. Okay. This is the function name. This is called as function name. So user will give some name to his function. User will give some name to the function. So I can give any name of my choice. Depending on the task that I am doing, I will write the name. That is the function name. And after completing all the statements in the function is going to return a value, which we call it as function type. This is called as a function type. For performing the operations inside the function requires some values. Those are called as parameters. So if I ask you to calculate factorial, so to which number I need to calculate the factorial? So there should be some value. That value is called as a parameter. That value is called as the function parameter. So it may be sometimes there may be one value, there may be sometimes there may be multiple values. So if there are multiple, I'll write int x, comma int y, comma int a, comma float b, comma character x. Okay, you can write multiple parameters in a function, but the return type of the function is only one data type. Sometimes if you are not returning, I'll write it as void. If I'm returning any value, I'll write it as integer. That means I'll write it as int. If the function is returning a float value, I'll write it as a float. So all the three are combinedly called as function header, are called as function header. And in user defined function, you have the other part also there, that is the function body. That part is called as function body. So these are the three parts that are included in the function body. So you can write some variables inside the body. You can write some statements like x is equal to a plus b, or you can write a for loop. You can write an if else statement. You can write a while loop. Anything we call it as a function statements. Or you can simply write a is equal to x plus b star c. That is also a statement. Any instruction we call it as a statements. So the function body, it will have the actual statements what task I want to perform. If I want to perform factorial, I'll write all the statements. If I want to find out the Armstrong number, if I want to calculate something, I'll write the task in the form of these instructions, which I call them as function statements. They are called as function statements. And after completion of all the statements here, at the end I'll write a statement called return. Every function, every user defined function will have this return statement. Got it? Hello? Hello? You are there, but what about the remaining two people? You there or not? Okay, okay. So this is about the function definition. Okay. The function definition, it mainly consists of function header and function body. Okay. And next, moving on to the next one. So the function definition, it looks like this. So you'll have a function type. So what type of data the function is going to return? If it is not returning anything, I'll say it as void. If it is returning any integer data, I'll write it as int or float character. Function name. So you can give any name of your choice according to the task that you are doing. So try to give an appropriate name. There is no problem if I give my own name also, but the name which you are giving, it is a name of the function. It should be like what task I am doing inside that function. If I am calculating factorial, better to give the name of the function as factorial. Suppose if I am displaying the Fibonacci series, better to give the name as a Fibonacci series, so that the someone who are using that, they can easily identify that, okay, this function is for calculating factorial, this function is for calculating cube root. So you can identify the task by looking at the function name. If I give my own name, so the someone who is using that function, they can't identify why, what actually happens inside the function. Okay. Next, so you can have a list of parameters here. So the list of parameters, you sometimes you will have no parameters, sometimes I'll have only one parameter, sometimes I'll have multiple. If you have multiple parameters, you can simply write them multiple, like int x comma int y comma float f. So you can write any number of parameters as per your choice. And next, coming to the body of the function. So this is what the complete body looks like. So the body is in between the opening parenthesis and closing parenthesis. I call it as a body. Simple. Opening parenthesis and closing parenthesis. The statements in between these 2 points are the function body. So it will have some local variables you can declare here. So executable statements, like what I told, like using of for loop, while loop, if else statement. So anything you can write in this executable statements. And next, so every function, every user defined function will have a return statement at the last. Return is the last statement that is written in the function definition. Always the return statement is the last statement that is executed in the function definition. Once if the control executes the return statement, the statements which are written after the return, maybe you can write some statements after return, but those statements will never executed which are written after the return statement. Return means it will go to the some other position, it is returning. When the control is returning from this place, how can you expect the statements which are written after this statement will execute? So those statements will never execute which you write after this return statement. Okay. So this is about the function definition. And next one is the function call. So a function can be called by simply using the name followed by the list of parameters. So I have written one user defined function, and until and unless I call that function, so that function will never get executed. Such a big definition you write or such a small definition you write, the function definition will never gets executed until and unless I call the function. So without writing this function call, writing the definition is no use because it will never get executed. So what is the point of writing a definition without executing it? So it is pointless. So whenever you write a user defined function, so those user defined functions will get executed only when I call the function. So the function call is like this. So name of the function is like MUL. MUL is the name of the function. That means which I want to write it for multiplication. So I'm calling the function here MUL of 4, 5. So what are these 4, 5? These are the list of parameters I'm passing. These are the list of parameters that I am passing. That means to apply that multiplication operation, I require these two values. Okay. Later you can write like MUL of 4, 15. Four comma 15. Okay. So here again I am calling the function which is MUL with the parameters with the different values of parameters. This time the parameters are 4 and 15. Previously the parameters are 4 and 5. So I can call the function for multiple times. So whenever I want, I will call the function. So the function call can be simply written by using the name of the function. And if there are any parameters exist, you have to write down those parameters inside those parentheses. Suppose if you have any function without any parameters, I can simply call it like this. Add. Add is the name of the function, and this function is not having any parameters. I can call it like this. Add of simply no parameters there. Okay. So whenever you want to execute any user defined function, first thing you need to do is you have to define it, and second thing you need to do is you have to call that function. You have to call that function. Until and unless you write the function call statement, that function definition will not get executed. Remember it. Function definition executes only when I write a function call. And this is how I write the function call. The next is function declaration. So this function declaration is also called as function prototype. So you know variable declaration, like right? Same like a variable declaration, we'll write this function declaration also. See, like variables, functions must also be declared in C programming. And you can look here, the function declaration is almost similar to the function header. You can see function type, function name, and parameters. The same you can see in the function header also. So this is what you have in the function header. Function type, function name, and the list of parameters. only difference between the function header and the function declaration is, in the function declaration, you will have a semicolon at the ending. It is compulsory to write a semicolon at the end of the function declaration. See, that is also the part of the function declaration. Function header will have only these three parts: function type, function name, and parameters. And in the function declaration, you should have a semicolon also. See, it looks like this. Name of the function, the return type is int, name of the function is mul, and I have two integer arguments. I can write int comma int. If there are int comma float, or else you can write a float comma float. So I am simply writing the type of the parameters that I am passing here. Int comma int means the type of the parameters that I am passing here. But make sure you end up this declaration statement with a semicolon. So if you don't give a semicolon, the compiler will not accept it. It will show you a compilation error. And generally, this function declaration is written above your main function. Function declaration is written above the main. Okay, got it? So any doubts up to this point? So you have any doubts? Okay. So and we have four different categories of functions. See, when we are writing the functions, see, we'll have two names. Okay, I'll show you. See, see, main is one function, and I am writing one user-defined function. Then let us say the name of the function is factorial. Okay. In the main function, when I am executing this, in between this here, I'll call this factorial. And let us say I want to calculate the factorial of 5. Okay. So this is what your function call is. This is what the function call. And this is your function definition. See, whenever the control execute this function call statement, the control simply jumps to this point and it starts executing all the statements which are written in here. And after completing all the statements in the definition, then the control automatically goes back. This is what I call it as return. It returns to the calling function. Here we will have these two names. Those two names are calling function and the other one is call function. See, here I have two functions. One is main and the other one is factorial. Suppose when I'm executing the main function, in between execution of the main function, the control is jumping from this point to the factorial function. Here, who is the calling function? Main is the calling function. Main is the calling function. So main function is calling whom it is calling? It is calling. Then who is the called function? So main is the calling function and factorial is the called function. So see, after completion of all the statements in the called function, the control will return to the calling function. Always the control returns to its calling function. See, the control jumps from this point. From which point? From the main function, the control is jumping to this factorial. It is jumping to the, which is the definition of this factorial. After completion of all the statements inside this factorial function, the control will simply returns to its calling function. So who called it? Main function. So main function is the calling function and this function becomes the called function. After completion of the definition of any user defined function, the control will automatically returns to its calling function. So whoever is called him, so who called factorial? Main function. So main becomes the calling function and factorial becomes the called function. So after completion of all the statements execution and factorial, the control returns to its calling function, which is main. See, here you have two functions like calling function and called function. And when the control is jumping from the calling function to called function and called function to calling function, definitely the control will jump from that point to this point. That is from the calling function to the called function. The control will definitely jumps from the calling function to called function. But at the time of this control jumping, there is a chance of data communication between these 2 points. There is a chance of you can communicate with terms of some data. If the data is transferred from calling function to called function, we call it as parameters or we call them as arguments. If the data is transferring from the calling function to the called function, that data is transferred in terms of arguments. That means if the data is communicating from the calling function to the called function, there exist some arguments. At the same time, if the data is transferring from the called function to its calling function, that will happen with the help of this return statement. So due to the presence of the arguments and return values. So arguments may present or may not present. At the same time, the return statement may present or may not present. So depending on these criteria, we have four different categories of functions. We have four different categories of functions. So those four categories are based on, so whether the arguments are present or not, whether a value is returned or not. So based on these 2 points, you will have four different categories of functions. You'll have four different categories of functions. Functions with no arguments and no return values. That is what it means. The data is not communicating from the calling function to called function and called function to the calling function. So there is no data transfer between these two functions. Data is not transferring, but the function jumps from calling function to called function. At the time of this function jump, there is no data transfer is not there. But look at the second one. With arguments and no return values. With arguments, no return values. That means, so from where you will get the arguments? Arguments will get from the calling function to the called function. So only communication is there from the calling function to the called function, but there is no communication. There is no data transfer from the called function to the calling function because it is not returning any value. Look at the fourth one. No arguments, but it is having a return value. There are no arguments, but it is having a return value. So those from there, that criteria will also exist. That means there is one-way communication is there. That one-way communication is either from the calling function to called function or from the calling function to the called function. Either one way is exist. The other way it won't exist. Look at the third criteria. So functions with arguments and return value. So this is a two-way communication exists. So the data gets a transfer from the calling function to called function. At the same time, called function to calling function. The first one is no data transfer. So data transfer from both the sides. Whereas the second and fourth one is one-way communication. Got it? So these are the four different categories of functions you can write. When a user is writing his own function, he can write the user defined function with either of any one of these four categories. Any one of the this following four categories, he can choose one among these four, and he can write his own user defined function. So got it? So any doubts up to this point?